Lovely to have you with us today. My name is Sylvie Fortin and I'm the editor of PASS, and we will be joined today by my fellow editorial committee members, Anne Barlow, Bige, Örer, and Jacques Senova. We're really glad that you've joined us today for these two panels. They will be taking place here in this same room, so you don't have to log out or log back in. Just stay with us. These sessions are a celebration of a major milestone, the launch of our online platform. These sessions are intended to extend and amplify the conversations that are underway in PASS, underscoring our aim to engage with ideas over time, across format, with care and with you. And so without further ado, I will ask my colleague Bige to start the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. Hello, everyone. We are really happy to be here together with Anne Barlow from the editorial committee of PASS to moderate this panel. Our discussion today will focus on storytelling, solidarity, and pedagogy as these relate to biennial practice. It brings together curator Claire Tancons, artist Maria Thereza Alves, and theorist Zairong Xiang to explore the role of the narrative in pedagogy, as well the connections between storytelling and solidarity. Narrative and audience play significant roles in the process. Which stories or knowledges get relayed and how are they told? Who creates them in the first place? Why and for whom? As evidenced in several recent biennials, research-intensive projects, public and community-led initiatives, and beyond human frameworks point to shifting debates. As traditional frameworks, hierarchies, and histories are actively challenged, what does solidarity look like? How is it enacted? Is it capacious enough to make room for the undetected inequalities that will inevitably be revealed in the process? In this context, what new forms of pedagogy are possible and necessary? Regarding the structure of the panel, I would also like to inform you that each participant will speak for 10 minutes. Then we will be asking a few questions and we will be also waiting for your questions. The question and answer session will take for 10 to 15 minutes. Please feel free to send us your questions at any time during their presentation. We'll present them to the speakers during the Q&A after the presentation. To send a question, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Please do not post questions to the panelists in the comments or chat section, as we will only be using the Q&A feature. So we are delighted to welcome three wonderful speakers today for this panel, who have also contributed with amazing, inspiring texts to our editions of PASS. Maria Thereza Alves has an incredible experience in participating as an artist to many biennials such as Sydney, Toronto, Manifesta, Sao Paulo, Taipei, as well as Documenta. And Alves was one of the founding members of Sao Paulo's Green Party, Partido Verde, in 1987. Zairong Xiang is assistant professor of comparative literature and associate director of art at Duke Kyunsan University. He is co-curating the 2021 Guangzhou Image Triennale. And Claire Tancons is a curator and scholar invested in the discourse and practice of the post-colonial politics of production and exhibition. Please note that this session is being recorded, including your question and comments. And please indicate your question is only for a panelist or for all the panelists. We will be also alerting speakers 1 minute before the end of their allotted 10-minute presentation time. And now I would like to give the floor to Maria Thereza Alves. Thank you.
Okay, and I have some images that will be coming up soon, so I'll just start talking. The 2016 São Paulo Biennale. I thought to start with this one because it was a very important Biennale, and then we'll just follow naturally what happened that came out from that. It was a Biennale curated by Jochen Volz, and it allowed the making of the work a possible reversal of missed opportunities. The starting point of the work was the relentless exclusion of indigenous voices in contemporary Brazilian society. The work began with 3 workshops that I conducted in indigenous communities in Rio Branco and the state of Acre, and then in Dourados and Aquidauana in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. The participants conceived of a conference which they would like to participate in if Brazil was not racist and they would be invited to participate in a conference. This included the making of titles for their talks, a venue, sponsors, and invited speakers. I am not seeing the images, the PowerPoint. Is it happening? Okay, good. That was the first image, and now we will go to the next image. Those are the 3 posters. Okay, there, thanks. Posters for this Imagine conference were made, one for each venue, and placed in public spaces in the cities where the workshops occurred. They had been backdated by a week as though the event had already occurred. This allowed settler Brazilians to possibly conclude that indigenous peoples were now part of the discourse in Brazilian society. I hope that this would open up possibilities for inclusion. During the workshop on the Terena Reservation in Aquidauana, we would have an epiphany. The local university had declined to host the workshop, and we decided we should not have our Imagine conference there either. But where? It is a small town with not many options. Someone suggested that we establish an indigenous university, and this allowed us to then fund sponsors such as the Association of Terena Women Warriors and the Tupã Front for the Liberation of Guarani Kaiowá lands. I had read about decolonizing the imagination in books, and I remember being very perplexed about how do you actually achieve the decolonization of the imagination. And then these women taught me. Next image. The final conference was in Dourados. The last time I had been there was in 1980 when I was 18 and needed to speak to the Guarani leader and land activist Tupã, who was to become my mentor. I wanted to make a national indigenous organization in Brazil, which did not exist at that time, and had joined the International Indian Treaty Council in 1978 in New York to learn how to do so. I was about 17 at the time, just turned 17. But Tupã explained that UNI, the Union of Indigenous Nations, had been created just 1 month before. I was shocked and shattered. And I said, what should I do now? And he suggested I continue the work on international indigenous issues instead. Tupã would be assassinated 3 years later for his denunciation of settler land theft. But his daughter, who was a retired school teacher when I met her, and his grandchild participated in this workshop, and it was an immense honor given to me. There I also met Guarani Örer, Rushu Katepuru, and Guarani Cunhapato Örer, both Guarani artists, teachers, and activists in the Jaguapiru Reservation, who were in the workshop and would become friends and collaborators on several projects. Next image, please. After the Biennale workshop, they invited me to give a workshop for the youth on the reservation. And here is Örer reenacting a performance of the making of Jimmy Durham's work, Resurrection. Next image. I was then asked also by Örer to make a book so that indigenous teachers could learn about contemporary art. I did not have the possibility to do that. I started to, but I am not an art writer to be able to do that. But they wanted, I had been giving a workshop on indigenous artists, and they wanted a book that covered indigenous artists so that teachers and reservations could teach that. That would be something I would like to work on. This image that you're seeing now is from Daniela Labra's Festas Triennale in 2017. And I'm mentioning that because I want to show how relationships continue from one Biennale to the next. This was in Sorocaba in the state of São Paulo. I made the installation of Full Void about the invisibility of the indigenous whose presence in the city's history has been relegated to a few pots and ceramic shards with no studies or interest as to whom might have made them. I wanted to place ceramic vessels throughout the city in historical places of importance to the settler population. There were about a dozen large ceramic vases. They're about up to my hip in height, placed in these, this was the train station, for example, former train station, and then the Museum of Modern Art. Next image, please. I first asked friends in reservations in São Paulo for a ceramicist. None existed. I then asked Örer and Örer in Dourados. They reported back the same situation there, but they said they would talk to the elders and learn to make ceramics. They were to discover that ceramics were no longer produced due to genocide. If you must flee quickly, you would take your light basketry with you, and the Guarani continued to produce fine basketry work, like these two behind me. The one on my right is by Senhora Pető, and the one next to it, the shorter one, is by her sister. They're very fine examples. But you would leave your heavy ceramics behind you. Soon you would cease to make them. Örer and Örer learned to gather clay, clean it, and make it into vessels and fire them. Next image, please. I asked the funders of the Triennale to sponsor a workshop for ceramic making on the Calapete Reservation in São Paulo so that Örer and Örer could reactivate ceramic making in the state. Next image, please. The funders asked if they would have pots for the exhibits from this workshop. I said probably not. It was a learning experience. They said they would not fund it. I explained that enslaved indigenous people made the city of Sorocaba. Thus, settlers were complicit in the destruction of ceramic making. The workshop was funded, and there is Örer working with the Calapete Reservation Guarani. Next. Another aspect of my work for the Triennale was a workshop with the undergraduate indigenous students at the local UFSCar University. These are the ceramics made by Örer and Örer, placed at the campus at the request of the students on sites chosen by them, very public sites like the cafeteria and library. I involved the indigenous students in the work where they interviewed non-indigenous students and asked them what do they think about indigenous peoples. I introduced the students, indigenous students, to the organizers of the Triennale, SESC, which is a private institution which offers cultural and health services. SESC could provide a safe haven for the students when they came to visit the city. For me, this was the most important long-term outcome of the commissioned work. Afterwards, SESC hired them to organize activities such as conferences, workshops, presentations, and videos. And also this allowed them to earn income and remain in school when funding was removed from them by the federal government. For projects of this importance, my process follows an initial premise, opening up to other possibilities. This puts an additional burden on the production team, which must secure funding for unknown elements that eventually become part of the work. The Fresnes team were always supportive and understood the complexities as well as the political and social implications of each part of the work. They, along with SESC, actively encouraged the process and were particularly attentive to their obligations to empower the indigenous students. I would like again to thank them all. They did an amazing job. Next image. For the 2016 São Paulo Biennale, I had made a mock-up book, Decolonizing Brazil, for my catalog pages. It is the purple cover that you're seeing. On the cover was a list of indigenous intellectuals from Brazil. It was a book that could not exist in Brazil at that time. It was a hoping act. In 2018, the indigenous students at UFSCar wanted to make it. They invited me back and SESC funded the entire project. Bravo, SESC. They were to write essays on indigenous leaders and activists, including student activists who are important to the history of resistance in Brazil and not published anywhere their histories. The work would also include an installation with videos, performances, indigenous language magazines, sound works, and a website. It's Descolonizando Brasil, the website. Next image. My next collaboration with Örer and Örer, next image, was, thank you, in the Guarani Reservation in Dourados was for Maria's House, an installation for Brooke Andrews' 22nd Sydney Biennale. Senhora Maria was someone I spoke to in 1983. She was the last person in my father's village, a bitterly racist place, who publicly stated she was indigenous. This was a courageous act. Her daughter gave me her small house in 2018. The idea was to restore it so that it could become a cultural center on recognized indigenous land. Funding has not been secured so far, so it's still in storage. This is an image of the installation. And Pote Örer and I continue to work on Maria's house, decolonizing the imagination, because it's still in storage. We founded the Guarani Nandewa Institute of Studies of the History of Brazil and the Jaguapiru Reservation. Next image. And the first manifestation of the Guarani Nandewa Institute and Maria's house is the publication Decolonization Continues, which is the first Guarani newspaper. It is edited by Örer and Pote Örer and translated into Portuguese, English, and a summary in Darug. They made interviews with those living on the reservation about racism from settlers against them. Mato Grosso do Sul is the most violent state against indigenous peoples in Brazil. And now Örer and Pote Örer and I are working on a new installation. It is called Decolonizing Botany, which will include Guarani names for plants. They will be sung, their songs, from that plants that are in the Guarani homeland, which are now known by European named after Europeans or settlers, names such as Goteia after Goethe, Strictiflora, Begonia Fernando Costa after the Secretary of Agriculture, long time ago, and Neuphoides Humboldtiana after Humboldt. The new work will be for the Madre Museum in Naples. Biennales have been, for me, places to experiment with new ways of thinking and making, which reaches a wider audience than is usually possible with museums and art centers. There are also the resources, which allows the possibility of a work that begins with the Biennale to continue to develop into long-term collaborations. This has happened with the works I made for Hu Hanwu's Lyon Biennale of 2009, Moacir dos Anjos São Paulo Biennale of 2010, and Caroline Christophe Bakarchiev's Documenta 13, among others. Biennales also offer the possibility that the institution's networks can be reconfigured into opportunities that can support and sustain marginalized voices beyond the framework and time frame of the Biennale itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We will continue, talking about your practice in the question and answer session. And now I would like to give the floor to Zairong Xiang.
Okay. Lighting, and I hope my internet is stable enough. Okay, so I got back to China in August amidst the global pandemic and a rising US-China tension and a global anti-China propaganda to start a new job at Duke Kunshan University, a US collaboration between Duke University and Wuhan University. Yes, that's Wuhan, right? The once epicenter of the COVID debacle. I came back to China after having lived in Europe for the past 13 years, 6 of which was in the coolest city of the world, Berlin. I have written and finished my first book, Queer Ancient Ways, a decolonial exploration, published in 2018 with an independent publisher, Punctum Books. As you can see, or you can hear from the title, it has the queer and the decolonial there, 2 of the very central and, to be honest, fashionable categories of debates in the past decades when I grew up as a young critical theorist. In the process, I was fucking around, hooking up with all kinds of people from all kinds of places. My internationalism was proletariat of the whole world united. As an Asian man cruising around spaces of anonymous sex and fast food intimacy, it has not been a, let's say, straightforward one. And as a scholar from a cultural background that is so easily being categorized and pinned down as one of a specific, it has been a constant struggle against what Rachel calls coercive mimeticism, meaning the post-colonial scholar is forced to imitate herself. I found a course in queer theory, which despite its incredible theoretical whiteness, Francophile, still is one of the few places of great liberty for weirdness, for unconventionality, for ugly feelings, and for talking about shit, literally. Not unlike the sex clubs and maybe dating websites that I wrote in my text for the past journal. For this, I thank Sylvie. I wanted to make queer theory better by proposing to decolonize it. Now I wonder who I had in mind, to whom I addressed while writing that book. My current work at Duke Kunshan University consists of both teaching and curating, teaching literature and art. I'm lucky to have been in the art world since I stepped into the real world in the last year of my university. We were building up the new Contemporary Art Center, Yulen Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. My work was also lucky enough to be part of the expanded art world. That's why I hesitate to make a rough comparison of working around the biennials to that of cruising, although they both share many similarities. Unexpected encounters, intimacy with strangers. Cruising is cruel. You need to be extra careful about many things, and the reward is not even guaranteed to be any good. Biennial has, on the other hand, less of a risk. They've invited me and paid me to entertain the audience. Queer Ancient Way in a way has been occupying a lot of undeserved space at the Biennial, especially the Berlin Biennial. I was one of the mentors of the curatorial program at the 10th Berlin Biennial. Besides famous people who have made much greater contribution to art than I could ever have been able to do. I gave a public lecture which later became the third chapter of Queer Ancient Ways. What do I know about curating or art anyway? But they trusted me, so much so that 1/3 of the audience fell asleep. The 11th Biennial listed this book as, Berlin Biennial listed this book as one of their references. I am very humbled. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at the Shanghai Biennial, which opened with a discursive program on water. So I talked about the water section of Queer Ancient Ways. The ancient Babylonian and biblical found a way to be present at the center of the ultra-contemporary cosmopolitan biennial. Who is responsible for this? I believe my students here would find slightly strange why a text about Babylonian and Aztec mythologies have anything to do with contemporary cosmopolitan cool art shows. Many of them very privileged young college students from China, mainly, for the first time in their family history could just be themselves, for which a careless observer or a bad anthropologist would rush to conclude that individualism has finally arrived together with algorithmic surveillance capitalism in the land of formerly socialist China. We had a discussion the other day after a series of questions that I thought was provocative. In my class, Global Art History, such as, is art beautiful or is art useful? Things I could sense that would also put half of the students to sleep, as they were clearly over that. They've seen Impressionism original at this age. They've been to MoMA, they've been to 2 editions of the Shanghai Biennial. They speak English and are cosmopolitan. They navigate the world at ease, just like their young Instagram friends, peers. They all have their MacBook Pros in front of them. I didn't provoke anything too scandalous with these questions until this one came up. Is art free? And should artistic freedom or autonomy be defended? The answer was an overwhelmingly no. I didn't expect that. Artist is also a citizen, they argue. They are as free as a citizen should be, they argue. But they are not above the law. Artwork should serve the common good, they said. They didn't quite say art needs to serve the people, nor do they seem to be versed in Marxist terminologies of social reproduction or art's condition of possibility. Artistic autonomy rooted in the individualism and bourgeois sensibility was not something, intuitively speaking, they deem any need or interest to defend, let alone fight for. What would it mean, I thought to myself, to talk about community building and the decolonial practice of collective care with them? What would queer theorization of the porous body that breaks the liberal myth of the individual mean to them? If that individual even exists, if at all, at the superficial level of the consumer and identity which each one of them grew up with, even as a college student at a fancy school such as ours. One of the greatest frustrations when I started to ally my own work with queer theory was that of the canon. While queer theory attacks many structures of power, be it patriarchy or heteronormativity in very sophisticated ways, its core theories remain largely canonic, that is, European secular and frankly white male. I spent so much time in Europe and the West to prove a ridiculous point, ridiculous because it seemed to warrant explanation and demonstration. The basic argument that people in other place and space also think about issues of, say, non-conformative sexuality. I call that decolonial with the global critical purchase of that terminology on the international stage. Like certain branch of queer theory, I worried that decolonial theory has become one of a hegemon. One similarly travels from the powerhouse of higher learning to illuminate the rest. Decolonial has tried to become a thing in China as well when they try to introduce Mignolo as Mignolo, for example. But I'm left wondering, if my students didn't have a canon to start with, what am I decolonizing for them? If there is no closet to start with, what does it mean to come out? Is there a space of radical indifference where they could care less about what we, the ones cruising frequently and thus discouraged frequently, deem of ultimate importance and urgency at biennials and international forums of art and theory? How do we build intergenerational, intercultural solidarity? How would that solidarity look like when our stories
Zairong? Probably Zairong is having an internet connection. And maybe in the meanwhile, we can move to Claire's presentation. Zairong, are you there?
Sorry. Shall we give Siren another
Yes,
minute?
he is there.
Maybe
I think
Siren can type and let us know if he thinks he might unfreeze anytime soon.
Sorry, I think you lost me. Oh, I lost you.
We lost your final sentence, Zairong. If you could just wrap up, please, if possible. Would you like to wrap up, Zairong?
Sorry, I think my internet just was lost.
Yes.
I don't know where until where I was stopped.
Maybe a last sentence from you so that we can move to Claire.
Yeah, cool. So I said how do we build intergenerational, intercultural solidarity? How would that solidarity look like when our stories have been told in profoundly different ways? How do we teach decolonization at the other end? That was the end, the last sentence. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zairong. Thank you. And Claire, we can continue with your presentation talk, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So let me try and start my screen share. Okay. And I think it's this one. Can you see my screen? Yes, good. Okay, wonderful. And I will just maybe start from the top, but first of all, and this is where we begin with Spring in Gwangju in 2008, 2009. But first of all, thank you, Sylvie, Bige, and Anne for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, Maria and Zairong, for your prior presentations. Mine will be extemporary, as it often is. And what that allows me to do, among other things, I hope, is to connect with my co-panelists. And one of the first things that struck me is how much resonance, despite the different topics we're addressing, what resonances exist between some of what Maria said and some of what Zairong said. So for instance, you know, when Maria speaks of biennials as places of experimentation, I could only but second that strongly, and I will explain further why, and or maybe it will become evident as my presentation goes on. And also I appreciated the connection that Zairong made between the world of cruising and the world of biennial. It's a connection which I have myself been tempted to do between carnival and biennials, if only because of the festival aspect, the temporary occasion, the specificity of the time space, you know, extraordinariness of the event, of course, the intimacy of these forced encounters, as we may call them, that occur both within the context of the yearly carnivals of the Americas, to speak of that, and of this recurring cruising ship that is the international biennial scene, right? Okay. Now, I'm a little worried because this is supposed to be a slideshow that goes on its own. Yes, maybe I just needed to okay. I'm just pausing to see. Yes, it goes on. I will address, my presentation is bookended by two biennials. I would say my first, or one of my first, and to date last. The first is the one that you're seeing on the screen, or rather my contribution to it, which was Spring in Gwangju under the artistic directorship of Ukuen Rizor, and that was for Gwangju Biennale 08. And the last will be Look for Me All Around You, which was for Sharjah Biennial 14, co-curated with Zoe Butt and Omar Kholef. We each had care, we each took care of our own singular session, but all together leaving the echo chamber, the umbrella topic under which each of our contribution took place, was jointly conceived, if you will. So it's basically a 10-year span of working with international contemporary art biennials, which is likely the only format, that of biennials, or that more generally of festivals, recurring cyclical event where the work I set out to do, inspired by the modern carnivals of the Americas, could have taken place. And none other but Okui and Wizor was better suited to be able to understand at a time, 2008, when most of my other colleagues, save maybe for Dan Cameron in New Orleans, with whom I was also working for the first edition of Prospect New Orleans, Okui was possibly the first curator to understand why Carnival may have anything to do with contemporary art and a contemporary critical discourse, and why attempting to set exhibitions into motion in what at the time I called procession and now called processional performance may have any bearing in thinking about other forms, other ways of historializing artistic practices that are left outside of the art historical canon, but also messing around with the exhibition format, which is so unsuited for, I would say, 90% of the world's creative production. If we are not narrowly focusing on art practice as it comes out of artist studios in the West, and when I say in the West, I really do not mean in the geographical West, but in the West of the conscience, in the West of the mind, which is to say so many of the international programs catered by, well, maybe Duke University, although thanks to our last speaker, maybe not so, NYU, Abu Dhabi, or École du Louvre, so, the importation of these programs and models generates much the same kinds of practices regardless of the siting. Now, back to spring in Gwangju. And this is something else I think that is paramount in terms of testing out practicing and forming new communities along the way, is the discovery, which has been so often criticized, but the discovery of settings and contexts in which business as usual simply cannot happen. So much as international curators are criticized for being, world hopping, and certainly nowadays also because of their, CO2 imprint, I know no better way to exchange knowledge on a truly global level than to test your own knowledge, to test your own identity formation in this context to which very little prepares you, whether it is in terms of the way in which you work, the way in which you communicate, and the way in which obviously you curate, and the way in which you form relationships. And so let me try and recenter though on spring in Gwangju. So at Okui and Wizor's invitation, I was one of the 5 so-called position papers. He himself, Okui, was co-curating the biennial with Ranjit Oskote and Eugene Kim. So there were 7 curators in total and 5 so-called junior curators, of which I was one at the time, 10, 11 years ago. And he immediately understood what I was aiming at with this business of an exhibition in motion, and gave me carte blanche. And what I based this project on, and we see here the May 18 Democratic Square, where the uprisings took place back in 1980, what I set out to do, obviously, was to try and find resonances between street theater practices in South Korea and what I knew to be street masquerading practices in the Americas, which is the background that most of the artists in the project had. So here we see Javas Lopez, a Brazilian artist who had done work in the Sambodromo under the aegis of Gentil Carioca's gallery. We saw Marlon Griffiths here. We have Laurent Gutierrez and Valérie Portefeuille. Here is Marlon Griffiths again from Trinidad, presently living in Nagoya, Japan. And here's Mario Benjamin, an artist from Japan. These are the slides introducing each project individually, and then we see the way in which the projects unfolded, and we see, most importantly, the students from Chosun University who participated in the making of the works under the leadership of the invited artists. So it means that there were extensive and intensive workshops in Gwangju, prepared for months, and then that unfolded over the course of 1 month. It was particularly fitting that the work be made and enacted by the students, because as we know, the May 18 Democratic Uprising was also a students' movement. It started with farmers, it was taken on by many other working sectors in South Korea and in Gwangju at the time, but it really ended with the students at the very location where the project took place, which is again on the May 18 Democratic Square, which is this big roundabout, where I am so sorry it has been disfigured by the Gwangju, I think the Gwangju Kunsthalle now sits actually where one of the little squares revolves, and it's totally disfigured this historic plaza, which is to say that this project could no longer take place. I of course love this image where we see the public in awe at what they were seeing, not fully understanding what was taking place, but certainly diving from their and memories and reconnecting the dots simply by dint of the very location where this event took place. Now, communication between the students and myself was often approximative, because very few South Korean students, actually at least 10 years ago in this particular location, were fluent in English. I had a translator, which allowed me to navigate, of course, what I had to do and to speak with I didn't need it to speak with my collaborators at the Gwangju Biennale Hall. But what is interesting is that somehow, in the absence of a common language, through a shared artistic practice with the artist and under whatever directions I could give, truthfully, they led the way, things happened. So there was a particular kind of energy, a particular kind of shared pedagogical exchange that took place between the artists and the students in the workshop that made this very work possible. Now, and just to finish, unfortunately, quickly, because of in the interest of time, and again, I was very pleased to hear Maria relate about how she was invited back a few years later to complete the work she had set out to do when she had begun it at the Biennale. With Gwangju and with Spring in Gwangju, maybe 5 years later, I was, first of all, I spoke a lot about this project, which in a way few saw live, but it was widely disseminated somehow because it was a very strong 1 hour and a half, 100 strong participant event, which I think indicated what can be done when different cultural formats are tested. Because obviously, the matter of parades and desfiles and processions is common globally and continues to be very active, certainly in many places in Asia. And I think that is one of the reasons why this project was so resonant, because of the location where it took place and because of the international audience that saw it, and that I think understood how so many of the vernacular practices that take place in this unfolding fashion, can be readily put to use within a curatorial and an artistic, with a curatorial and artistic intent, if you will. So this is a project that had a long-term resonance in terms of its afterlife and its posterity, if you will. And I was also invited back to Gwangju to speak about it, because it was found locally that the resources I had been able to bring together to make it happen were somehow had somehow emanated a kind of substantial core that has been maybe left dormant, much as the May 18 democratic uprising are celebrated, and much as we know that in a way they are at the origin of the Gwangju Biennale itself, as Young Woo Lee is always keen to remind us. Somehow it's also an event that is hard to commemorate, that is hard to memorialize, and somehow we spring in Gwangju from traditions of across the world, and with artists who had little currency in terms of either, of contemporary Korean history. Something happened that really had to do with the community of intention that was formed around this project in this very short period of time. And there is a video that we could look at if we had more time, but I invite you to log back into the site and to be able to see it. So that was spring in Gwangju. I spoke mostly of artists from the Americas, whether it is Jarvis Lopez from Brazil, or maybe Marlon Griffiths from Trinidad and Tobago, Mario Benjamin from Haiti. There's also Karine Olivier, who is American, but of Trinidadian descent. And indeed, my grounding, my foundation very much is with and in the Caribbean. I like to say that I walk in the world with a Caribbean historical consciousness, which I think everybody understands what it means in terms of the crossing of the Middle Passage. So that informs what I do. And so, yes, indeed, the Caribbean have been vastly important to my practice, but so has New Orleans. And I hope that the slideshow is not too jarring. I can also pause if it's too much images going on at once.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we will be able to continue with the questions.
Oh, hold on. I'm sorry. Have I already gone through my 10 minutes?
Yes, yes, I have told you 1 minute a little while ago.
So hold on, if I may just briefly conclude. I know you will prompt me back in. Here we are seeing, and in a way I said a lot of what I wanted to say about the way in which I work with Spring in Gwangju, but briefly, just to conclude, at least to reach the end of where I wanted to go, another important source of information has been New Orleans. And here there's a project that I did with New Orleans Airlift in New Orleans itself, but I will end with the way in which I put it into practice in Sharjah Biennial 14, where I invited New Orleans Airlift, who was able to work with various communities with which they were, of course, not habituated to work. So I will go back to New Orleans Airlift and to Sharjah Biennial 14 if I have the time with the Q&A. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's really great to hear you and to talk about all the projects that you have worked on, and which has this kind of curatorial integrity that we can see. And we will be able to talk about New Orleans Airlift and hopefully Sharjah Biennial in the question and answer session. I would like to start asking Maria about basically the nature of your artistic practice. Maria, share some common points with activism. And what kind of experience and knowledge have arisen in your work with the indigenous communities? And has this been changed throughout the years through biennials, you think? Could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Sorry. I have learned much from different communities about how to work. I have learned much from my aunt about how to continue not to ask questions, but to engage in discourse. It's one of the things about going back to my father's village. I came back with a US education and started blasting away with questions. And my aunt was very clear that that was not done. So she taught me very much on how to go back to my origins and have respect culturally for how we have discourse. Lately, I have been engaged much with the community museum in the Valle de Jico in Mexico, because their museum has been illegally closed. And so I've been doing many actions about that. And learning from during the first lockdown. I was in Naples, and I said, well, I want to learn ceramics because I had been inspired by Örer and Potevera, because when they started doing ceramics, when they learned you would start doing little ceramics. No, they started doing big. And so I said, okay, so I start too. And I thought, why, I'm not going to start with looking at ceramics from the West, why should I? And I remember that I had a huge amount of photographs from the collection of the community museum, which was closed. And I started learning to make ceramics from that. And then I said, well, why not ask the community museum if they want me to initiate a project about the closure of the museum with their objects, and people can start reproducing the objects that the community no longer has access to. So I learned ceramics also. I learned how to decolonize my imagination. I learned how to give a talk at the United Nations Human Rights Committee. I learned how to get information to give that talk. Very stressful. So I have been formed from a long history of Indigenous work and struggles, and hope to be able to continue, although the situation in Brazil is every day very harsh. You know? But Örer and Vera Pote, we continue to do new work, and we see how that goes.
Thank you, Maria. Very nice to see you. I have a couple of questions. One is around the nature of your work, because it reflects adjacencies, overlaps, and connections between different sets of concerns, such as water, land, destabilizers, and plants. Can you speak a little bit more about this way of working and how you move across various artistic practices and other disciplines?
Yes, this gives much problems to art historians and art producers, and I'm very sorry for this. It's because I really have a problem with the Western idea of this categorization that keeps, it really seriously affects the arts still. I mean, we've been liberated very much, but still affects it and makes us into hyphenated people, like artist, activist, artist, poet, artist, writer, artist. So I have so many hyphens, and if we were within an Indigenous society, we wouldn't have to worry. I would be Maria Thereza that does things that she can do, you know? I don't see them as being separate. I see them as you have to participate as fully as you can in society and in community, wherever you are as a community. And you just have to use what talent you are good at, or that you can learn, and to participate actively within your community. So sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's making a political party because you need a new constitution, and the only way to change the constitution is to lobby senators, and you can do that as a political party, and you say, Senator, the question of the environment in Brazil, we would like you to please support this section of the constitution.
Thank you so much, Maria. I had several other questions for you, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're going to have to move immediately to Zairong. So if he is there. We mentioned at the beginning that you're involved in the Guangzhou Image Triennial in 2021, which revolves around the idea of rethinking collectivity. And this has been described not only as a review of history, but more importantly, an exploration of the wider possibilities of coexistence in the present and in the future. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on your current thinking about this, and perhaps on notions of collectivity itself.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for this question. So the starting point of this image triennial coincided with the pandemic. So it was inevitable that things related to the pandemic came up as question of concern. And why we were so we for my section, we are actually a curatorial collective called the Hyper Image Group. So with my other colleagues, we've been talking about this through. Back then, I was still in Berlin. We were talking through this through WeChat and Zoom and all kinds of these digital format. Meanwhile, there was a kind of suddenly a global temporary collectivity that was forming from time to time, initiated by Lady Gaga, for example, or initiated by whatever initiative to keep people at home, right? To keep people apart, so that through an attention to a kind of collectivity. So we kind of in the process we came up with this idea that maybe what counts as collectivity in this very moment of separation it needs to be rethought. So we proposed this theme as really as a question. We don't know how this collectivity would look like from very different levels. How would a collectivity that would form in a biennial and a triennial that half of the artists cannot be present? I think the Shanghai Biennial is facing the similar questions. Actually, as far as I know, also the curatorial team cannot be there. Some of our curators, Gerardo Mosquera, couldn't for the time being couldn't come. So what does this mean to how do we think of an exhibition that does not also fall back to a kind of digital format alone, as a quick solution. So these are really the questions that came up both in the process of conceptualizing the exhibition, and as something that the exhibition hopefully could trigger more discussion about.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting.
Yeah, Zairong, thank you so much. And I also have one question for you. You have recently published an article, COVID-19 on the epistemic condition, and an inspiring article that I think that makes everyone who reads it to think. And how do you think academic anti-racism may face the real challenges that the pandemic has brought to the global community?
You mean epistemic
yes,
challenge?
Epistemic, yes.
Yeah. I will not summarize that text here. But what I wanted to say, maybe it's the background kind of feeling that I had in that very moment. So this was early March, April this year, when the let's call it the shit show was still in the part of Asia, right? And the epidemic was at the moment of becoming a pandemic. Suddenly we are facing a global crisis. And very soon the response that we observe, at least what I observe, is a quick recourse to the canon. Very fast, very quick. All these critical reflections that we have been doing in the past how many decades were suddenly disappeared. you know, your indigenous cosmologies and whatever traditional medicine. No, 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 no. These things cannot solve the real problem, right? For the real problem, we need biomedicine. We need science. We need binary thinking. We need Cartesian logic. That was what I wrote against Alain Badiou's text on the epidemic condition, that he said the solution is very simple. It's the Cartesian logic. I was like, you know, that was a very scary moment that coincided with racism on the street. For the first time ever, after having lived how many, like 13 years in Europe, that I encountered face-to-face racism. Like racism exists everywhere all the time, but explicitly, right? They don't in the coolest city of Berlin. Normally, it doesn't happen on your face, but there was almost a passport that people feel that they had to reach, on one hand, the canon, the most Eurocentric possible canon, and on the other hand, the passport towards racism on your face. So these two things kind of coincided, that I felt I could not keep my mouth shut at that moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move on for a couple of questions to Claire. I would like to ask a question around ideas of the transnational, which is getting lots of attention in recent months, particularly, and just thinking about that notion and applying it to the various projects that you've been involved in multiple parts of the world, in very different contexts. How does that term, apply to your practice, or how do you view it in terms of how you work?
We can't hear you, Claire. Can you unmute yourself? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for your question. And before I answer it, because I'm very taken by my co-panelists' thoughts, something that I wanted to respond to, Zairong, in terms of the curatorial and the state of the curatorial post-pandemic, or I guess within the pandemic, we're not quite post. I think that we have to resort, to use the beautiful title of Valérie Cassel-Olivier's exploration of Black performance practices, we have to resort to radical presence. We have to embrace radical presence. We have to seize wanted to broadcast all we do and to mediatize every one of our faits et gestes. And of course, the reason why I think that radical presence becomes ever more important is that, to your point about how the binary generated by centuries of Cartesian thinking is all wrong, and the return instead to vernacular practices that have been honed by millennia of community working is, of course, I go back to to festival and to the cyclical nature of the work of co-mourning that is never generated by any occasion other than a cyclical calendar, which is to say the universal workings of the body, of a form of cosmology, of a cosmological body, if you will, which translates into our individual bodies. And so really, we have to learn again to embrace the presence in the here and now in a way that may not be broadcast, in a way that may not be televised, in a way that may not be Facebooked, in a way that may not be Instagrammed. We simply have to be where we are and to do what we need to do among ourselves with those who are present. That applies with that applies to curatorial work. So that was a quick thinking and to about radical presence. Now to the idea of the transnational, and I believe, Anne, that you're asking the question maybe also in light of the very project that New Orleans Airlift did, which was called the Transnational. And for the Transnational, New Orleans Airlift found the way to get this old airplane into this this site where they invited various of the Emirates silent majority, which are Emirati residents, but not Emirati citizens, right? So in the case of the Transnational, it was primarily Emirati residents of Asian descent, not so much of African descent, mostly of Asian descent. And the project was very much based on storytelling, to go back to one of the interests of these panels, simply getting out the stories of how these communities were able to stay connected to home as it was, or how they left it, and home as they were trying to make it in this place that they know they could not fully belong to. And I think that this state of mind, which is not one of a double consciousness, but rather of a fully diasporic consciousness, one where diaspora is ever a state of being, ever a state of belonging and becoming at the same time. I think that this fully is the meaning of the transnational in a way. The transnational is really ever evolving, ever in becoming. And I think that these Emirati communities very much embodied this state of being. Now, how does that apply to curatorial practice? I think that as regards curatorial practice, especially when working within a biennial context, the transnational is first and foremost the community of artists whom you bring and gather with you in a particular locale where you all learn to find your way. And if and how this then translates in a form is in turn for the biennial's audience to find out. For me, and to conclude and to finish on your sentence, I want to believe that the form I experimented with Look For Me All Around You, which is good old Marcus Garvey. He's about to be imprisoned in Atlanta on account of trumped up mail charges. And he essentially said, you can imprison me, but my movement, my global movement will continue to exist. So look for me all around you. I have disseminated, right? So Look For Me All Around You, I attempted to expand the very frame of the processional to the entire biennial, at the scale of an entire emirate. And so, yes, to me, if only because to go from Sharjah to Kalba, from the east to the west coast of the emirate, you have to go through other emirates that may not be entirely transnational, but certainly there's a transience, there's a traversing that takes place. And it's ever in motion. And there were many ways that, the motion continued, unlike, and this is a little jab at some of the project's critic, the performative was not simply at the level of the bodies, but also at the level of matter and materials that were ever evolving. So, and I will stop there, but there were also instances of non-human performance, which made the project always active, if you will. So that's my bit about the transnational, specifically as applies to Look For Me All Around You and to New Orleans Airlift project.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We could talk about that for a long time, but sadly, we have to continue. I know Bige also had a question for you, so I'll move to her now.
Yes, in fact, we have so many questions to all of you, but we have this time limitation. I hope we will continue later on. Claire, I mean, you have channeled multiple voices of the rebellious students from the May 18 democratic uprisings of 1980 and reflected on the foundational moment of democratization of South Korea in Gwangju with your exhibition titled Spring. And how would you be able to connect with your exhibition Look For Me All Around You in Sharjah, where you also follow the million diasporic voices? Do you see your practice as empowering alternative voices and hidden stories in the society?
Oh, this is very ambitious. I would say that I can never really set out with such high ambitions, but I hope to be able to set the very frameworks that will then enable the artists and their various collaborators on site to do so. I really think of my work as if you think of a dancer as, you know, giving the core and letting the members to flow around. So I try to set a strong core and then to let it do what it has to do. In a way, I answered, or I anticipated your question maybe, and answered it when I said that if with Spring, the processional performance was in the exhibition in motion itself. With Look For Me All Around You, I tried to bring the processional at the level of the entire platform by connecting East and West, and even another emirate, which is Al Quwain, which is where the transnational took place. And much as we know the emirate as a former British protectorate and kind of semi-city-state of sorts, much as we know the emirate to be a governmental entity of sorts, each of the 7 emirates are quite distinct, and to seize collaboration among them was in and of itself, even under the aegis of the Sharjah Biennale Foundation, a bit of a piece of work. But of course, you know, what was most challenging in a good way to establish was simply the ability to bring people out. And again, if we are to think of the idea of the transnational and of the diasporic, what was striking to me is how most of the participants ended up not being Emiratis themselves because of the relationship to the body, because of various religious and cultural codes. And so in fact, the many participants in the various artist projects tended to be Emirati residents, but not citizens. And you could see, you know, the strong divide between who was spectating and who was being spectated, if you will. Now I'm straying away a little bit, you know, from one project to the next, and over the course of a 10-year span of working with various biennials, I think there's a continuous thread. And I think it has to do with the fact that this very idea, you know, I think of the processional and of processional performance as always already a pilgrimage and a migration. Necessarily, this is what it entails. And so therefore, by following this mode of proceeding in the world and with the various works which I invite artists to create, it necessarily brings on a particular kind of a sensibility, and I hope that it also resonates with what I come to think of as a global diasporic consciousness.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm really sorry that we have to, you know, end this panel now, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the great panelists and Anne for co-moderating this session. And I would also like to thank the community of PASS, which we are creating together, all the authors, writers, artists, curators, and other professionals who have contributed with their text to the 2 editions of PASS. I hope we will grow our conversations.